All right, okay, anyway. I'm Leon Baird, and I'm going to talk to you about designing for digital content. So, basically, one of the things that's starting to happen at the moment is people who traditionally have designed for print are starting to be asked more and more to do content for digital products like tablets, phones, web, etc. And often don't always have the experience needed to translate what they've done for years for print over to digital. So this whole little talk is going to give you sort of an overview of the different types of things you may be asked to design for and give you some advice on software you may use, and also as well some technical information upon the sorts of designs and things that you will be needing to do. Now, in terms of, this works. In terms of what you do at the moment, you've all got a workflow probably, unless of course you've already gone into digital stuff, that you've been using for a long time, and you have a set of software that you use, and you have the core skills and pieces that you've stuck to. So a lot of you will be using Photoshop to do all of your digital imaging, getting everything to look nice, producing images, editing them, cropping them, colouring them, taking out spots and blemishes, all these other things. Illustrator to do your artworks, create your vector graphics, maps, things, logos, and then of course compiling them all together into InDesign, whereupon which you'll be outputting a good old-fashioned PDF. And of course traditionally that would go off for print, and if you're going to get what felt like sophisticated at the time, you would then say, oh, I'm doing that for web as well. So you would get that sort of workflow. And depending upon whether you work for yourself or a company, you can always tell you're either going to do all of that yourself, or in the company role, you possibly would be doing just one stage of that sort of production cycle. Now, the problem is, when you move over to do things digitally and you change over to the digital side, it's unfortunately nowhere near as simple as that. What programs you use to prepare content can vary considerably and wildly between what you might actually be used to using, and unfortunately there isn't one-stop shop for, saying, oh, we will use this software to get this ready or that software to get that ready. And also as well, where you're actually going to at the end, there isn't one simple product you might need to reach. There again could be many stages of output that you would need to go to. So therefore, when you're designing, whether it's actually making content, preparing artwork, or actually designing functionality, you need to think about some very different set of apparatus to what you might be thinking about when you were designing for print. So if you want to solidify it down into some simple ideas that you might need to use, you could say, when you're designing for digital content, depending on what course you're designing, it probably falls into some of these categories. Something to do with user interface, something to do with user experience, and of course the content that those two things will be providing. Now when you're doing print, the user interface is rather simple. It's a piece of paper, and technically there's a few things you can do. That you can throw it at people, or if you don't like it, you can put it in the bin. But in terms of digital side, of course, you need to be aware of where actually the design is going to be used. Is it a tablet? Is it a phone? Is it a desktop? Is it the web? And if it is the web, is it designed to be used on everything or just one specific thing? Because that changes entirely the way you would need to think about user interface, user experience. And then as well, the product you're designing. Is it an app? Because again, you might be needing to design a whole user interface, whereas if it's a web, that means something a little bit different. So all of those things need to be grouped together. And when you're thinking about it, the usability of your product that you design will really be encompassing those two key ideas. The content can vary, and the type of content you've got will vary considerably as you're sort of putting it together. But those two features are there. And when preparing for print, you are more concerned in the presentation of this. But these other ideas are things you need to sort of get your head around when you're starting to think about going digital and preparing content to be digital and digitally usable. Now, in terms of where you might be going, we could think of the web. And of course, the web contains a whole pile of things you might need to think about. And also as well, of course, apps. Apps for devices, either desktops, mobiles. And that split between desktop and mobile is found whichever direction you're going to go, whether you're thinking I'm going to go over to web or we're going to go over into apps. And that split is quite different because what you need to think about is that changes entirely any type of user interface you need to think about, and the way your design needs to work and interact with people. Because of course the big difference is on a desktop you are using a mouse, and a mouse has a presence on the screen, a single presence, one place. And as it moves around your design, you can flag interactive elements to the user using rollovers. You can light things up. You can use the gesture saying, I'm interactive, click me. And until that person has rolled over that element, it doesn't need in any way at all to symbolize any form of interaction. But unfortunately, when you go over to mobile, there is normally no cursor. You have a finger, and the finger makes no contact with the device until the user presses it. So therefore, you don't get a hint or a gesture or any information about what is interactive. So you need to consider a whole set of rules and ideas of how you communicate with your design to say, I am interactive, click me, because you do not have the luxury of being neutral. Your interactions and your thoughts of what the functionality does should stand out and be visible by itself. So that changes entirely the way you need to think about how you design and put together your artwork, your products, and of course the user layout. One thing I would say is for web, there is a side of web design which is basically, you're aware there's responsive design. There's another theory, I'll talk a bit more about responsive design later, but there's another theory called adaptive design. And that is whereby, if you are working with a developer, a person who writes code like JavaScript and things, as a designer, of course, that's often the thing that you wouldn't do yourself. But when you are doing designs, you need to think about the fact there will be a developer on the digital side who will add functionality. He can do what's known as an adaptive design, which says, if we're on a desktop, then we will use these ideas, and we will have rollovers, and we may have buttons. But when we go over to mobile, we'll take away those buttons because actually the user can swipe through images, which is much more natural than fiddly little buttons to press to go left and right. And also as well, actually, we will take away things like rollovers. Because rollovers are very bad on the tablet and the mobile phone world, because when you actually have a device and you press it, your first click activates a rollover, not actually what the button does. And many users get so excited by that first interaction when it lights up, they think that's what it does. They don't realize that actually what they're looking at is a rollover. So therefore, they never click it again, so they don't see what it actually does. They just press it, it lights up, and they go, ooh, and then they try something else, and that's it. So it's recommended in modern web, unless you've got the ability to use that adaptive design, where you change physically how your design works and functions between mobile and desktop, it's recommended that when you're designing, not to use old school things like rollovers, but to get that away, to be pure, everything gestures what's interactive without the need of a rollover. Now, as we go through as well, when you're doing your designs, you need to also think about the platforms. And of course, on mobile, there's a very big division between the platforms of iOS and Android. The user experience, the way it works and the functionality is very different between those two platforms. And I've just mentioned those two. There are, of course, other platforms, BlackBerry, Windows, and all of them have their own unique things. So therefore, what you need to do is either do a design that is neutral, that radiates out by itself, or a design that fits into that ecosystem. So if you're designing an app, then what many designers sometimes do, especially if they're making an app for multiple platforms, is they make it look like an iOS app, and then that gets Android people in a fluster, because then they go, ooh, I don't like this, ooh. And then, of course, you do it the other way around, and they get even more in a fluster. So you have to think about the platforms and the way it works, which means sometimes, if you don't own that device, you might need to go out and do research. That thing you have to do quite regularly in digital is research, finding out how things work and what you need to do as a designer for it. Now, on the website, also, there is a thing coming up called web apps. And web apps have been here for a while, but they're coming into their own right now. And ebooks as well is another way that web technology can be used. Basically, they all use web technology. And of course, with a web app, that is where you will be making an app, but it actually runs in the browser. And you therefore have no loyalty to any system. You can do either your own design completely, or you can try to mimic an existing system. The advantages of mimicking an existing system in your design might be because the users already know how iOS works, or they already know how Android works. But you can also break away from that if you wish. And some people have made web apps that completely stand out on their own. Others have made them so that you would think you were using an iPad app, and you can't actually tell the difference. So those are all things you need to think about, is what is it that I'm actually designing, and what am I going to be preparing for? And of course, in the world of mobile as well, phone and tablet is very different. And that basically is the subject we call responsive design. And this is a completely new way of designing. You have to think about forgetting a lot of what you already know about designing, because when you design for print, you're designing for a thing that's static. It always looks the same. It always has the same physicality. But as soon as you start going digital, often your designs need to be things that actually respond to where they're being displayed, and can be physically totally different on a small mobile phone to what they would look like on a large desktop. And of course, television is joining the party as well with all of this. So television as well is making it that your designs have to be completely able of being displayed literally at any size and looking good and responding to those environments. Now, one of the other things as well about design, which is a thing that not many people realize unless you're a technical-minded soul, is that actually web content or web design is being used as well within apps. And whenever you are designing apps, there are two splits between how you design. There is what we call native UI, which is native user interface. And that depends on the platform. So if you're on iOS, that's how a button looks. It has a bar at the top of the screen called a navigation bar. There's a toolbar at the bottom. And you use those things for getting around the app. But the second you present content which needs to be interactive or readable, often it is actually rendered through web technologies. So it uses the same web technology you would see in your browser, but contained within an app. So therefore, when you're doing your responsive designs, they can actually be utilized almost anywhere. And in the modern day and age, what's going to happen more and more is you will probably be asked to do a design, and you need to think about the fact that it has to be totally universal. And it could be used anywhere from a phone to a tablet to a desktop to a laptop to a television, and it could be used in a whole manner of operating systems. And you might have to gesture for touch, or you might have to conform to mouse clicks. So you have to think about all of those different ways of operating. And of course, the content in itself, you need to think of the content. Do we use multimedia, or should we use multimedia, videos, audio, animations? And how is the content itself going to be interactive? And that's aside from all of the things I was talking about in terms of the design of the app itself. Should we have an infographic? That will explain how something evolved over time. Those sorts of things. So when you go to the world of digital, all of this sort of ideas you need to sort of think about before you do your designs. And think about how are you going to give that experience which the device or the service needs. Now, one of the things which is quite cool, and you probably, unless you've been away somewhere, you've probably noticed that Apple just released a new operating system, iOS 7, which amazingly is exactly the same as iOS 6 in terms of functionality, but in terms of aesthetics is very different. And one of the things which is really cool for designers is one of the annoyances about the past was when you were designing for mobile devices was the fact there was a physical world of difference between the iOS side, the Apple world, and Windows and Android world. But now with iOS 7, actually, a lot of those differences have become uniform. So there isn't a great deal of aesthetic difference between those platforms. Of course, functionality is different. The way it works is different. But it's a much more unified world now. And that makes it a lot easier for designers because now what it means is you no longer need to think, oh, I'll have to think like shiny, 3D, glossy. You can now think in a more neutral tone that would actually render across multiple devices and still look quite cool. Now, as we go through this and we think about things like user interface, user experience, and content, and we put that together, let's just think for a moment about user experience. Because one of the things that you get, which is very different from designing for print, is the fact that you have to communicate many different ideas about how the content should function and work. In print, that concept was also there. It was what you would call the reading order, or the readability of your design. Where would people look first to know to read that bit first, second and third, and they would move through your design, and you'd have your reading order using densities and things to guide people in. All those skills will still be there, but instead you have to explain functionality. And you have to think about how the user is going to actually work with your device. So a few key things. Keeping your design simple and minimal. Try not to overload your designs with information and content. And try to keep things as simple as possible. Also as well, making use of instinct. People have spent a long time learning how to use digital devices, whatever they are, whatever the platform. And there will be an expectancy. So I know a lot of people, because everybody likes to do things that are new, I hear this a lot, I'm going to do it totally different. Just because that'll be cool. I'll make it so that you have to use the page upside down and back to front, and you'll have to hold it in the mirror and go invisible while you use it, or some crazy thing like that. So, and that's all cool, but of course doesn't produce a very good user experience, because then the poor old user sat there going, And what you'll tend to find in the world of digital is you have a very short time span to seize somebody's attention. And if you don't do it within, I think the time is about 5 to 10 seconds, users think, oh, the internet looks good this time of day. And then they'll be making their way over to the web to look at something else or try the other app they've downloaded. So you've got to make sure that frustration doesn't kick in because users are unfamiliar, because you've tried to break the mold too severely and do something too far out there. Use people's instincts. And of course as well, making things attractive and being aware of the platform. So if you're designing for a platform and the overriding theme is white and minimal, you're not necessarily presenting a theme that conflicts with that or clashes. So you keep the aesthetics there and the coloration's the same. And in fact, that's one cool thing about the new platforms is that white minimalism is in. So I hope you like your neutral, sandy, white, minimal, and of course Helvetica Noi Light as well. That's an essential modern must of any digital platform. So therefore that opens the subject of what we call interactive design. How do you make your designs function when people have to use them and have to click them? So what we have are a few key ideas: consistency, proximity, function, and metaphor. And these are things that you might not necessarily have had to consider or think about when you're designing for print. Now the first one, consistency, is quite a straightforward idea. That's a button, and it's round. And when you know that's a button and they're round, when you come to another thing which is round and it looks like that, you'd be forgiven if you thought it was also a button. Whereas one of the things that came out, and this was quite cool, was the Adobe Digital Publishing Suite. And that suddenly opened the world for people who could use InDesign to create apps. And we got that. All magazines started pushing out digital versions, and people would open them and get rather confused because page one, that was a button. But when they went to page 2, it was a bullet point. And imagine their disappointment, like a Christmas that never happened, when you press it and absolutely nothing occurs. It's rubbish. Because on page 2, it looked like that. That was a button. Because page 2 was by Bob, and page 1 was by Jenny. So, you know, there has to be a consistency because people will learn. And if you're going to do a product which people will use regularly, that means from the very start, either conforming to the consistency of the platform, or if you do develop your own ideas, making sure they remain consistent to your own ideas. So when people look at your product, they might think, oh, is that a button? And when they press it and find out it is, everything that looks like that should then be a button from then on. Because nothing is more annoying than looking at the page and thinking, I don't know what it is. And when you saw people using those digital publishing suite products, because they were by people from print, not the digital people, you would see this amazing thing of people doing this, randomly tapping the screen, going, nope, next, nope, next, and getting a bit annoyed. And of course, 2 or 3 pages of that, and you'd be immediately to the web. So consistency is there. And of course, it depends on the idiom you're designing for as to how you lay things out, because there might be an expectation. Like, look at the web. People are usually very familiar that most websites, unless of course they're radically different, and some of them are, and some of them are very commendable for being so. But if you're doing the more corporate website, you don't want to be radical. You want to be consistent to a design and a brand. And therefore, people expect to find things like title bars at the top of the screen that contain, that contain links to other pages, products and features. And one thing by chance has evolved purely in nature, like natural selection, and that is the logo at the top left of every website, it doesn't matter what it is a click to get back to the home page. Just one of those things. If it didn't do that, people would be horrified. So you click that and we're back to the home page. And of course you can play with presentation. You can change things subtly, but if you go too far away, you've got to keep to that element of consistency. So the next idea, once you've got your consistency sorted, is then proximity. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are 2 buttons at the top left corner, and there's a doohickey at the bottom right. Whatever it does, we don't know. And what you will notice is, when people are looking, even on a tiny screen like a phone, or a big screen like a computer screen, people has an area which is around the interaction that they notice. And down here, if they're pushing the buttons up there, down here there could be a marching band, there could be fireworks going off, there could be things exploding, and they wouldn't see that because they would be pushing a button up there. They might notice something, but it wouldn't be within their attention span. So when they click that thing up there, and down here something magical happens, and then that's it. They probably have missed it. And in fact, because most people are not very observant, they probably wouldn't even notice anything was different. They just go, oh, what did that do? So therefore, we have to bring together functionality into the proximity of whatever it is that they actually affect. Because I know lots of designers like things to be neat and consistent in other ways. So I knew one person that did a design. He says, it's really cool, and I've made it lovely because all the buttons, whatever they do, are at the bottom of the screen in a little bar. And it's like, well, that's nice, but how then do you know what they do? He said, well, you see what happens. I said, well, I've just pressed that and I haven't seen what happened. Where was it? He goes, it was up there. And the second, as a designer, you have to show somebody how to do it or what it does. You failed as a designer. You failed as an interactive designer. And you should be publicly flogged. Because it's not acceptable. So therefore, we need to keep these things together. So now, when we press things, that's cool. But then, of course, platforms in the device itself. Because when I'm on a computer, I've got a mouse pointer which is very small. And it doesn't really, unless you've got some accessibility features on, and you've got one of those giant mouse pointers that fly across the ship like a huge galleon. Instead, you've got a very small thing. But when you're handling mobile devices, you've got a grip big fat hand, and it's an exceptionally grip big fat hand if it's like mine. And therefore, when I use it, my hand tends to cover up things because it's not very see-through. So as a result of that, if you put, and you're designing for mobile, and you place interactive objects above the proximity of what you're affecting, you'll push the old button, the thing will change, and then very often you're not aware of it at all. So put them underneath. So therefore, when you press, you will see, oh, look at that, isn't that exciting? It's gone blue now. And of course, this is the first time we will have actually seen that if we were using a mobile device. So the proximity and the location of interactions should always be with their results, and you need to think about the placement of the interaction depending on whether it's desktop or mobile. And of course, if you want to be consistent, one idea fits all, then always do it underneath the item, because then that will work when you're dealing with touch and when you're dealing with desktop. Now, the function of something is then trying to think about what it does, and is that the best way of doing it? So if I wanted something to be big in small, and it had a range of possible values, then I don't want to be typing in numbers. A slider would be nice, to go, ooh, small or big, to take me between those range of values, rather than me typing in a number and a pop-up coming up saying that's too small or that's too big. So think always about the functionality of what's going on and how you could gate that into something the user would expect to make it simple. And make sure as well that your design reveals that functionality without the user having to be told. And that's where we come into the final subject of metaphor. So when we think about metaphor, look at that, there's a blast from the past. You're all nostalgically going back now, those of you who are designing in the early days. Some of you might be a bit too young for this. You'll be going, what's this? It's like when you take an audio cassette out in front of your children and they go, what? This is the past. This was the original GUI, not the original one from Xerox PARC, who were the people who actually invented it, but one of the first GUIs that came out. And what you will see, and the GUI, of course, is graphical user interface, for those who don't know. And when this came out, Apple had to think of a way of using metaphor to communicate functionality, because at that stage, computers, if you didn't know what the command to type in was, you couldn't get it there. So on a PC, you had to type into the DOS prompt to launch your programs. You had to know dir would tell you what was in the directory, and if you could fathom what appeared on the screen, you could then cd to a different directory, which of course is a disease, and lots of other things, and it got very confusing. So here, a directory looked like a folder, and they created a gesture of a double click, which then became to represent you opened something to see inside, and a bin was used to delete things, and a disk looked like a disk, and a calculator looked like a calculator, and a document looked like a piece of paper. So they took the metaphor from the real world to represent that functionality. Of course, when the bin got something in, it went fat and it went full, so then you would look. Although, when it had its modernized, we went over to IKEA bins, as we all know, because everybody had IKEA bins. The old trash was gone. And of course, then that would put a piece of paper in, not as cool as a fat bin. I like the fat bin. All right, and of course, the crash, the best thing ever, that got killed off. It went sad. And it looked like it had just been the cartoon death went on there, sad Mac. So does that make sense about metaphor? These ideas you need to think about. Communicating functionality through gesture, image, and user experience. But that brings in gesture, because in the world of touch, we have gesture, and a new vocabulary of interaction is being born. Swipes, scrolls, rotates, pinches, all of these things. And the trouble with that is, how do you know when you're supposed to pinch something and swipe something, or tap it, or double tap it, or triple tap it? And do you tap it with one finger or six? And yes, you could, if you want to, do a 6-finger tap. It is possible. Your developer could do that for you. Don't know why you'd want to do that, but you could. So therefore, this means suddenly that you need a new graphical language to communicate gesture as well as functionality. And people are starting to come up with ideas of using things like arrows and making them very rubbery, stretching them to represent a pinch outwards, or compressing them to pinch in, stretching them around in a circle to do a rotation, or a little thing flashing to do a tap. And don't forget that these gestures could appear on your designs momentarily and then disappear. So they don't have to be there, because I do here, well, I don't want to put that on there because it spoils the picture. So the answer is, well, don't. Just float it for a moment so people can see. You can do this in digital. Float it for a moment so people can see. But you'll need to think of that language that communicates gesture as well. So for mobile, you might need to think about communicating gestures. Now, of course, good design also means sometimes having an argument. And this happens all the time with clients and digital designers, because your client will say, I want to do 300 billion things, and it's all got to be on this one page. And then there is another 600 billion items. And all you need to do is watch anybody from a company who's obsessively wanting to show you how good their website is, and you'll see a 13 click-through bread trail going right the way through to the witch's cabin in the forest to take you somewhere in. And it's like, I would never find that if I was on the homepage. How would I do that? So it's amazing to think that actually there is one rule that's been in web design from the earliest day, and it is this. 1, 2, 3. 3 clicks should take you to anything you need to use. Now that is worth having a fight over with somebody who wants to do something. So trying to keep your functionality simple and your organization simple. So as you're creating content in design, if you can meet that, it's not always possible. Sometimes you have to give way to the corporate world and say, yes, here's your 300 billion links, and yes, it will take you 20 minutes of going through 300 options to get to that piece of information. But if I'd designed it, it would have been 3 clicks. Because what you need to do is remember less is more. And trim away functionality. Do you really need to know this? Do you really need to know that? Do you really need to get that piece of information? Strip it out to actually what the user would want. And again, in adaptive design, you might think, when you're on a mobile device, let's bring to the front the things you would need when you're mobile. Whereas when you're on a desktop, keep them there, but do not lose the functionality. Nothing annoys somebody more than when they're on their phone, they go to do something which isn't available because they're on their phone. So don't cut functionality, just move it around. Make it more ordered. Now, when we think about user interface as well, we need to think about a few other things. When we're designing artwork for user interface, this can be a bit of a nightmare. Is it an app? Is it web? What do we do? And the olden days, everything used to be small. Make it tiny, it's the web. Make it as small as you can get, it's the web. It should be tiny, no bigger than an atom. But of course, and now, we've got the opposite. We've got large, big things, Retina displays, HD displays, which actually deliver things with the same resolution as print. So therefore, if you bang out your tiny little images that you used to do for the web, when you open it on a tablet, it will look like somebody's been sick on the page. Not a good look. So therefore, to get around this, we often need to provide the same artwork in multiple sizes or at bigger sizes than we were traditionally doing. And as a result of that, it means, therefore, the way forward really is to use vector graphics, because some people would traditionally use bitmap programs for all of their design work. Like, I know people who would use Photoshop, and every icon on a website or everything digital would be made in Photoshop. Well, that's cool, because Photoshop's great. But the problem with that is you're either going to have to downsample or upsample your images. And every time you do that within a bitmap, you sacrifice quality. So if you make a big image smaller, it's going to get a little fuzzy. And if you make a small image bigger, it's going to get exceptionally fuzzy. We're talking Friday night fuzzy. So what you need to do, therefore, is to use a program which is what we call resolution independent. And that's vector art. So programs like Illustrator make a fantastic platform for actually doing this sort of work. So when we come to do things, Illustrator is what we would use, and we need to be aware of the use of different file formats that we would generate from something like Illustrator. So when we think about making things, we of course will be outputting things, and of course there's the good old JPEG. And people think, JPEGs for everything, yay, do JPEGs because it's digital. It might, but it depends. The JPEG is of course perfect for photographs, and that's what it's designed for. It will allow you to scale down an image to be the smallest size possible, and in fact what I recommend is when you output a JPEG, do you know the sliding quality level? When you're using your Save for Web, drag it to the lowest level, and then work your way up. Because it's amazing, when people work their way down, they get frightened halfway, and they go, ooh, that's too much. Whereas if you start at the bottom and you work your way up, you go, yeah, that looks fine, much lower than what you would do if you started from the top. So do it from the bottom and work your way up. Also as well, JPEGs compress data by throwing away information. So what it means is if you actually look close at JPEG artwork, a little phenomenon is going on known as artifacting. And the more you compress it, the more artifacting you get. And what it means, therefore, is JPEGs are totally unsuitable for any line art. They're great for photographs, but for icons and line art and things with solid colour in lines, they are terrible at, because the artifacting will result in distortions. Of course, you could put it up to be very high quality, but then JPEG at high quality is actually going to be larger, possibly, than some other formats. So one of the other format that we use instead is PNG, the Portable Network Graphic. And the PNG file, or the PNG, as it gets called, is brilliant because you will get JPEG quality artwork, and it will do photographs, but more importantly, it will do imaging without the artifacting. So it is perfect to use for line art, icons, and those other things. And the other thing, unlike a JPEG, a PNG file actually has got a full 8-bit alpha channel, which means you can store transparency with soft edges. So you could have a round image with a shadow, and that would all be preserved within the PNG file. And of course, we've got the GIF, which is apparently pronounced GIF. That was launched, for those of you who don't know. You don't want to get that muddled up, otherwise you'd look a right fool. GIF. Yeah, so GIF is basically another format, and GIF is very different. It will use a minimal amount of colours. So unless you wanted to look like you've gone back to the 1980s and you've just done your design on a Commodore 64, then the probability is you wouldn't want to use a GIF for a photograph. But it is perfect for icons and small artwork. It just doesn't do transparency very well. So therefore, if you've got an icon and it only uses 3 colours, you can make a GIF that only uses 3 colours. And that will make it the smallest size possible without sacrificing any quality. So those are the state of affairs that we've got. But we also as well have in vector world. So these are all bitmaps. In the vector side, of course, we have EPSs. Now EPSs, you all know, are vectorized, and they're great for print because you get the best quality possible. But they're totally unusable for digital. EPSs have no bearing at all in the world of digital, but there is an equivalent, and it is slowly being adapted and adopted. And it is the SVG file, the Scalable Vector Graphics. The Scalable Vector Graphics file is pretty awesome. It's basically an EPS for the world of, an EPS for the world of digital, and it will allow you to create files that will be resolution independent. Now, they are already up and running in the web, but the trouble is they're only supported in new web browsers. So if you're rolling out web design and you try using them, they will fail when your client says, we're on IE6. In fact, everything will fail when your client says you're on IE6. It's like being told you have a minute to live. It's not very good. So therefore, SVGs will work great on new things, but because a lot of people are doing designs that are actually only aimed at mobiles, all the mobile platforms love SVGs. So what I've been doing for some while is when I've been preparing artwork for digital design, I've been using SVG files whenever I'm designing web apps. Because they will render, and they can be at any size, and they will render at the size they should be, so it will be pixel perfect. And file size, they're much smaller than any equivalent PNG. So they're a great file to use. And what's really cool is if you've got somebody who knows what they're doing, you can even animate all the individual shapes and things. So you could have one like fill pulsating with light or something to look like it's light up or sliding on and forming itself. So you can do all sorts of cool things with SVG files. They're the future. But for now, we have to still keep providing bitmap files for backwards compatibility. And if you're making native apps, what's rather remarkable is in fact native apps like iOS apps and Android apps won't touch SVGs either. They will want bitmap artwork as well. Now when you come to design this, a lot of people say, what's the best way of doing this and what's the best way of using it in Illustrator? One of the things you can do is use your artboards. Now how many of you use Illustrator and you know Illustrator really well? That's a good number of people. For those of you who don't, this might sound a bit scary. Use your artboards. And I don't know if you've been using them a lot, but what you can do is very often you'll be asked to make a design. And part of your job will be to do a mock-up of the user interface and all the artwork for the individual icons. So what people will do is they will do a mock-up, and then spend time unlayering it all and pulling out little artworks and things, or if they know Photoshop, they might do slicing, which can be done. But the trouble with that is it takes all very time consuming, and when you're designing, it's sometimes not great. So what I do instead is I use artboards. So I will actually set up an artboard, do my one little icon on it, and then I can export that artboard as a PNG file just by itself. And then I have another artboard for another icon. So every icon and little thing has its own artboard that needs to be a separate file. Does that make sense? And then I have one big artboard for the mock-up of the user interface, where I can then use symbols. So all of those little artworks that you create in your artboards can be converted into symbols, meaning you can then just move them onto your user interface as a symbol, and that will link them to the original design. So if you change your original design, like they say, could that be blue? You change it on the artboard, and when you go to your mock-up, it's also blue. It's the same way. So therefore, using Illustrator is great because it means you can very neatly design mock-ups whereby you've got all the assets ready to be exported, and when you export your document, you can just roll through your artboards and then have all the individual artwork prepared. And that's much more useful than just doing a single mock-up, and much more efficient of your time. Now, in terms of designing mobile apps, every developer has got what we call user interface guidelines. So you can get them from developer.apple.com or developer.android.com. And they're called, Apple's are amazingly the Apple user interface guidelines, or the Android user interface guidelines, the Windows or the BlackBerry user interface guidelines, they're all there. And those are docs that tell you as a designer what you should be doing to design for that platform. How big things should be, how small things should be. The colors, the design, the look and the feel, the functionality. What you can do and what you shouldn't do. Because I always hear this, I want to make that blue and I want it to look like a bin. And the answer is you can't because it's red and it's supposed to look like a slider or whatever. So, you get this conflict of what a designer would like to do for aesthetic reasons and what the platform says you should and can't do. So as a result of that, you sometimes can find projects cost a lot because developers have to do a lot of coding to realize a design because the designer has broke the user interface guidelines. So as a result, a whole day was needed to make something look like that. So therefore, it's very important always to have a close working relationship with a developer so they can keep you in check, but also, if you're designing for a platform, you should have read the guidelines. You won't get any sympathy from people like me if you turn up and you haven't read the guidelines. Have I read the guidelines? I've looked at them. But then I design apps as well, and I do the coding, so actually I know how they work. So it's in the guidelines that you'll get all this sort of information, where they will show you, this is going back a bit, they'll show you all the things about the size, the layout, where things go, where things should be, so you'll know exactly how big to make things and how big to design. And that's very important because what mistake many designers will do is do a great big giant icon that looks brilliant when it's great big and giant, but when it scales down to the size it will be, it looks rubbish. So therefore you should be designing with things at the size that they actually are. And for many platforms like iOS, all of these designs are actually just a shape. You just build an image which is transparent, and then it's just the shape of the artwork, not actually any colouring, just the shape. Now, Retina displays and HD displays confuse people as well, because suddenly we're in a world of duality, and if you're designing for apps, you'll need to consider how you're going to tackle high-definition displays. So it's very simple, or at least on Apple. On other platforms, it can be a bit more complex. There's my artwork, and when it's at the standard resolution, it's 350 by 250 pixels. Now, when we design for digital, what's the DPI of all your artwork? Anyone? 72. I just heard one tiny, faint, terrified 72 come out from the corner of the room, but it was totally right. 72 DPI. Now, what then happens is people read about Retina displays, and I get artwork at 300 to 322 DPI, and that's rubbish. Because Retina displays and high-definition displays want artwork always at 72 DPI. So all digital artwork is 72, it is never more than that. But what they will do is the following thing. The difference is in pixel density of the screen. So therefore, the number of pixels from the screen is more. There's more. And in fact, on the iPad Retina display, there's twice as many as on a standard iPad. So therefore, if I'm doing my artwork and it was that size of the standard display, to support a Retina display, I would also need to do my artwork, but it would be 600 by 500 pixels. Does that make sense? It'd have twice as many pixels. It would still be 72 dpi, but it would have twice as many pixels in it. And Apple has a rather funky naming rule. It would be icon at 2x. So it's whatever the name of your artwork is with at 2x, meaning twice the size. Does that make sense? Of course, you could just provide a big version. And as older devices, which are non-HD or non-Retina, phase out, we will be able just to provide the larger artwork. But there is a severe performance hit on the older devices, which are already slow enough, without you slowing them down double so with your big images. So therefore, that's what we would do. But what it also means is when we do web design, we need to think about that. Because if we still provide things at porky small sizes, then on websites they will look bad. So again, it's encouraged that when you're doing your web design and you are preparing an image, if you know the image is going to be 300 pixels wide, make it 600 pixels. Because then it would look good on HD displays and Retina displays. Now I know it would take a little bit longer to download, and there are some controversies about that because when you're on mobile you might not have the best connection. But with 4G being rolled out and this whole idiom of always being on, what's going to be happening in the future is people will have a consistent network connection. Although I'm saying this in one of the biggest not spots in London. I don't know if you've tried using your device anywhere through here. If you can send a text message, you're on a good one. But most of the occasions, when you've got a slightly decent signal, with 3G already and 4G, you will get speeds which will be the equivalent of broadband. And hopefully a data package that would allow you to download more than one picture. Although that's not guaranteed. So therefore, that's basically what you would need to do with Retina displays. Now, if you're doing things like Android, they're a little bit more complex. They actually will break the artwork into many different categories. At its simplest, small, normal, or large, or extra large. And it's more complex between low density, medium, high density, extra high density, etc. So therefore, when you're designing for those platforms, you might need to provide more images. So if you're doing an Android app, you might need to provide 4 or 5 different images, depending on what's there. Although having said that, most developers are a bit lazy. They just do a high-density image and then think that's good for everybody. Now, what about mockups themselves? Well, when you're designing and you're laying out your design, one idiom more or less does everything. Although it can vary from platform to platform. One of the big differences between Android and iOS is the fact that Android has hardware buttons. So therefore, you press buttons and menus pop up, whereas iOS doesn't, so it needs to be on screen. But this rule is based on iOS, but you get similar designs on Android as well. But instead, you might put more options into the menus. So instead of having quite as many buttons on the screen, you can have a few on menus. And also, Android actually has a dedicated back button. So therefore, you don't need a back button when you're designing for Android. It's already there on the device. So therefore, whether it's Android or iOS, you will have a bar at the top of the screen. On iOS, it's called a navigation bar, and on Android, it's called an action bar. But I prefer to use the more platform-neutral name title bar. It's the title of where that design will be. And if it's on iOS, you will have a back button. And sometimes on Android, you may have a back button. Although, as like I've said, most devices will have a dedicated back button. And you may put some other buttons for more options on the right. Again, that's more iOS. On Android, you'd probably use your menu button to bring up a menu of options. And of course, there would be a toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and in there you could put a whole number of buttons and features, or again, you could put them into your Android menu. So when you're designing your app, you would sort of work around that. Of course, if it's a tablet, then you might have a toolbar on the top and bottom, or just on the top. So you can be more flexible with your layouts when you're designing for tablets than you can be when you're designing for other things. Now, I'm going to be a bit controversial and say I personally think something is happening at the moment which might frighten designers, so be prepared. You can fasten your seatbelts, put your crash helmets on and take a tablet if you wish. I think the day of designers doing mock-ups will come to an end very soon in the near future, because a new generation of designers know how to code and are actually building products which are there. But if that's not scary enough, also as well, the whole nature of design is possibly going to change in the future. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But for now, one of the things you could do, which is rather cool, and I've worked with a number of companies where they've trained designers to do this, and they've said, we wish we did this 2 years ago, is SDKs. Now, what the hell is an SDK? It stands for a software development kit, and it is the thing you get from the manufacturers of mobile devices to build software for the actual devices. So, with Apple, it's called Xcode, and that's what you use to make apps for Macintosh, iPhone, and iPad. And Eclipse with the Android development tools is what you use for the Android side. And what's really cool about this is the following fact. Both of them allow you to design the user interfaces graphically without writing a single line of code. So rather than sitting there doing a mock-up on paper, you could use the tools that the developers will actually use to build the apps, and without writing any code, learn how to build actual working user interfaces, the real ones that will get used in the app. Much more effective than doing a mock-up. So that's the thing that you can play around with and have a little look at, and I would definitely have a look. I'm not saying it will be easy to learn immediately, but with a little bit of learning, there is no code needed. You can build user interfaces, put them together, and set them up graphically. Of course, they're terribly fiddly and badly designed because they're made from programmers, and programmers are terribly fiddly and badly designed as people. So we know this much, but you can learn to do it yourself. And I've worked with a number of companies teaching designers to do this. So rather than opening up Illustrator and doing a mock-up, they'll open up Xcode and build a storyboard. And it actually all works without having to do any code at all. Has somebody got the time? Because I haven't got the time on me. Sorry? It's 10 past. Okay, cool. I was going to say, if it wasn't 10 past, I would have given you a quick demo of that. But anyway. Now, for content itself, HTML5 is what's actually being used to build content for most platforms and devices. And HTML5 can do the most amazing multimedia and the most amazing interactive content. And also, it uses a new type of design called responsive design, which throws out a lot of what you would know. And yes, when I say multimedia, I mean video, audio, and animations in 2D or 3D. And 3D in HTML5 is unbelievably easy. So if you've got in your brain, you'd like to have a 3D model that spins around, if you can download Blender, see the right thing there. There isn't a program called Blender, but there is a program called Blender. And it does really cool 3D, and it's free. Or if you use Cinema 4D, or Maya, or Studio Max, cool. And you can build 3D models, and now get your developers with only a handful of code to throw them onto web pages so users can spin them around and inspect them, and this is now easy and can be done on mobile or desktop. So this goes there. So multimedia can do all of that. If you're preparing video, you'd be using MPEG-4 files. And every computer platform now comes with video editors. So usually the video will be done for you, but if it's not on the Mac, you've got iMovie, or on the PC, the rather dreadful Windows Movie Maker, but it still works. And all of which can export MPEG-4s with H.264 video, as it's called. And that's the same video that does Blu-ray HD. So that's becoming sort of a standard for the web. So that means really good. And because it's MPEG-4, that means on mobile devices you get much better battery life. So do you remember using Flash on laptops and watching your batteries die after about an hour? Well, with HTML5 video, when the people start using that instead of Flash, you will then get a more natural battery life when you're playing video on your laptops. And of course, MP3 as well for the audio side. Now, in terms of interactive stuff, here's a cool little tip. Adobe Edge is a really amazing program. This can be used to do animated HTML5. And without having to do any coding, you can open it up and do designs, drop in images, and animate them with a simple-to-use timeline on the screen and put together stuff which is pretty awesome. And export it out and save it as HTML5. And Adobe Edge is part of the Adobe Creative Suite and put it through. It can also be made interactive, but the bad news is, if it's simple, you can do it without any code. But if you want to do anything clever, and being designers, you'll want to do things which are clever because that's your nature, you will hit a wall with what you can do without any code. But you can do anything you want, you might just need to get a developer. So HTML5 is really cool. And one of the things it does is code or code-free. Well, there's a number of options that you can use to build things code-free, but they all have their limitations. Dreamweaver, of course, is there, but Dreamweaver is very complex. That's a bit like using a bus as your family car. Dreamweaver does loads of stuff but isn't easy to learn. And if you don't know how to code, it's also difficult to learn. And Adobe Muse is quite cool. That is very easy to use. It's based on Adobe InDesign. So if you can use InDesign, 20 minutes later, you can use Adobe Muse. But it is limited in the type of content it can create. So therefore, if you want to do a website with the look and the feel of a 1990s website, then Adobe Muse is what you would do. And it will do all sorts of lovely things, and it will allow you to build alternative versions for mobile and tablet, but they are alternative, it's not responsive. So it does work, but with severe limitations, and as a result, is only usable for certain things. And of course, Adobe InDesign itself, it can also output HTML, but it's not a design, it's not a site, it's just content. It needs a developer to make something happen with it. So therefore, there are other code-free products, but they all have the same thing, a template. And if that template isn't what you want, you have to get another template. And if that isn't what you want, then you're a bit stuck. So therefore, one of the things is with responsive design, it makes this code-free stuff very, very difficult, because with responsive design, your artwork originally was sized so it would work on any screen. But as I've said earlier on, now that we've also got as well tablets, telephones, and televisions, we need more than just one design that fits all. So with responsive design, we have what's called a fluid grid. You all know grid design. You're all designers, you should do. Unless you're not a designer, in which case what you're doing here. And when you're putting your content on there, you'll have whatever you're doing, some text, an image, a bit of a lazy design, another big image, and that's there. And of course, what will occur is this is going to be designed using percentages rather than fixed numbers. So therefore, it can scale to screen sizes. But that will only work so much because the text won't scale, the text will reflow. And as a result, it will break when it gets too small or too big. And these are what we call, in responsive design, a breakpoint. And the only way you can find them is by doing it. You can't sit on paper and in an ideal world go, it's this size, or this size. You have to do your base design and see where it breaks and deal with it actually there and then. So as a result of that, you need to be able to pick up when it is. So therefore, because we're running a little bit tight on time, this will all be available online, and I'll have a PDF of this that you'll be able to get hold of. There is a little formula you can use to calculate your percentages, and you can basically say the thing of this size would jump in, and that will give you your percentages. So literally, you can work your percentages out quite easy from numbers. So when you're designing, you just do it with fixed numbers, and then you can convert all of that into percentages. Or better than that, let the developer do all that stuff. But some designers like to be in control. And of course, what will happen is when you hit a breakpoint, your design will move and change to a new grid. So everything will become a new layout and a new design. So I'm afraid the world of one design that stayed the same is gone. Your designs have to move, breathe, change, and become elastic, which is a completely different way of thinking. Now, this idea, in my opinion, doesn't work, big, medium, and small, because you don't know where the breakpoints are until you know where the breakpoints are. And you have to deal with where the breakpoints are. So unless you're going to sit next to a developer, it's very hard. But I've got a thing for the future. And this is it. This is my controversial bit. Don't try to do it code-free. Be brave, be strong, take a deep breath, and learn to write HTML5 and CSS3. Unlike HTML4 and CSS2, it is actually very easy. And I've worked with loads of designers who, when this was suggested, screamed and left a Tom and Jerry shaped hole in the wall. And once we dragged them back in with a cattle prod, an hour later they could do it and were amazed that it was quite easy. So don't be afraid. It is the same as working with InDesign, but just with text files. So when you open InDesign, the first thing you do is place content on the page. That's HTML, and you say there's a title, a subtitle, a paragraph, an image, and a link. That's HTML. And then you go to your properties panel and say, I'd like it red with a border and blue, and that's your CSS file. So you change over to another text file and put in how that box should be styled. And that's like your paragraph style. So it's really easy to learn, and I'm putting together a course aimed at designers to make it an easy thing with Academy class to actually learn how to do responsive design with HTML5, aimed at not developers, but designers. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with Academy class, and then we can mail you once we've got that set up. but that's a thing we're going to be putting together in the future and sort of designing. But what I would say for now is if you want to have an experiment, Komodo Edit is free, and it's one of the best tools for doing this. And what's brilliant is you don't type anything. You don't think programmers type. What they do is they press 1, 2, and a program they're using types in the code. And then, with the tab key, they type in values. And that's what this program will do for you. So it's a free program. It's much easier to use than some of the big programs like Dreamweaver and things, and it will only do the code in a very pure way. And it's what I use to teach everybody to do this. And everybody I've worked with who's been in designers and have never done code before have all within a few hours in the day learnt the basics of this, and they've all gone on. When I've spoken to them later, they all were quite happy and excited with the new design possibility. So it's something I think you can all learn. So just do it. Don't try to put it off. I would recommend definitely going to that world. Okay? Anyway, that's it. So enjoy your design.